You have 30 seconds to tell me why I shouldn't cut off every single dollar that's kept your family afloat for the past decade. The silence in that mahogany-paneled conference room was so thick you could have carved it with a knife. 37 of Greenwich's most elite family sat frozen, their champagne flutes halfway to their lips, staring at me like I'd just announced the apocalypse. Which, in a way, I suppose I had. You know, there's something beautiful about watching people who've spent years treating you like furniture suddenly realize you own the entire house. The shock on Veronica Sterling's Botoxed face alone was worth every sleepless night I'd spent scrubbing her marble floors and raising her neglected children. But let me ask you something before we dive into this story. How are you doing today? Where are you watching from? I hope wherever you are, you're somewhere comfortable, because what I'm about to tell you is going to take you on a ride that'll have you questioning everything you think you know about power, justice, and what happens when the universe finally decides to balance the scales. The weather here in Greenwich is crisp and clear today, much like it was on that October afternoon when everything changed. When 30 years of careful planning, quiet endurance, and strategic invisibility finally paid off in the most spectacular way imaginable. My name is Alara Vance, though for the past 8 years, most people have just called me the Help. This is the story of how I went from being the invisible black nanny who scrubbed toilets and wiped noses in a mansion that wasn't mine, to becoming the most powerful woman in a room full of people who thought they owned the world. Picture this. Me, standing at the head of that conference table in a custom Seville Row suit that cost more than most people's cars, holding documents that would reshape the entire social hierarchy of Greenwich, Connecticut. The same hands that had just hours before been folding Veronica Sterling's designer lingerie were now holding the keys to a $12 billion empire. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I tell you about that delicious moment of revelation, before I describe the look of absolute horror on the faces of people who'd spent years making racist jokes within earshot of me, thinking I was too stupid or too powerless to matter, let me take you back to where this all began. If you're enjoying this story so far, please hit that like button and subscribe, because trust me, you're going to want to hear every single detail of how this played out. Share this with someone who needs to hear about justice being served ice cold. And leave me a comment telling me about a time when someone underestimated you, because after you hear my story, you'll understand that sometimes the universe has a very long memory and an even longer reach. But let me start from the beginning, back when I was young and naive enough to believe that hard work and kindness would be enough to earn respect in a world that had already decided my worth based on the color of my skin and the size of my bank account. I was 22 when I first walked through the service entrance of Sterling Manor, carrying nothing but a worn suitcase and a heart full of hope that this job would be different from all the others. I'd been working as domestic help since I was 16, putting myself through night school, dreaming of something bigger while scrubbing other people's messes and pretending not to hear their casual cruelty. The Sterling family seemed like a blessing at first. The pay was better than anything I'd ever seen. The room in the staff quarters was clean and private, and the children, 8-year-old Madison and 6-year-old Connor, were sweet kids who just needed someone to actually pay attention to them. Their parents, Veronica and Richard Sterling, were busy with their social obligations and business ventures, which meant I'd have real responsibility, real impact on these children's lives. I believed in the fairy tale back then. I believed that if I worked hard enough, if I was indispensable enough, if I loved those children enough, I would eventually be seen as more than just the help. I believed that excellence would speak louder than prejudice, that dedication would overcome discrimination. I was so beautifully, tragically wrong. The first sign should have been the way Veronica introduced me to her friends. "This is Ellie," she'd say, never bothering with my last name, never mentioning my education or my qualifications. "She's wonderful with the children." As if that was all I was capable of being. As if caring for her neglected kids was the height of my potential. But I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself that actions spoke louder than words, that eventually they'd see my worth. I threw myself into that job with everything I had. I learned Madison's learning style and helped her overcome her reading difficulties. I taught Connor to tie his shoes and ride his bike when his father was too busy with golf to bother. I organized their schedules, managed their household staff, coordinated their social calendar, and basically ran their entire lives while they took credit for having such a well-managed home. The children adored me. Madison would crawl into my lap when she had nightmares, and Connor would save his best drawings to show me first. They called me Ellie, but the way they said it, with such love and trust, made it sound like the most important name in the world. Their parents, however, had other ideas about my place in their universe. It started small, the way these things always do. Comments made just loud enough for me to hear while I was serving dinner to their guests. "You know how these people are with money," Veronica would say when explaining why she kept my pay in cash, as if I couldn't be trusted with a proper paycheck. "She's lucky to have such a good position. Most of them can't handle this level of responsibility." Richard would nod along, adding his own observations about how grateful I should be for the opportunity to work in such a refined environment. As if exposure to their wealth was payment enough, as if I should consider myself blessed to witness their lifestyle from the shadows. But it was their son Bryce who really perfected the art of casual cruelty. Bryce Sterling was 28 years old and had never held a real job in his life. He'd failed out of 3 different business ventures, all funded by his parents' money, and had moved back into the family mansion with his equally entitled wife, Cassandra. They treated the house like their personal hotel, and me like their personal servant. "Ellie," Bryce would shout from wherever he was lounging, never bothering to come find me. "Bring me a sandwich. And make it fast. I'm not paying you to take your time." The fact that he wasn't paying me at all seemed to escape his notice. Cassandra was worse in her own way. She had this habit of leaving messes specifically for me to clean up, dropping jewelry on the bathroom floor or spilling wine on white furniture, then watching to see how quickly I'd scramble to fix it. She'd actually time me, and then make comments about how some people just weren't cut out for quality service. But the real humiliation came during their dinner parties. The Sterlings loved to entertain, and they loved to show off their perfectly managed household to their equally wealthy friends. I'd spend days preparing for these events, coordinating with caterers, arranging flowers, making sure every detail was flawless. Then I'd serve their guests, invisible in my black uniform, while they made jokes about the help right in front of me. "You're so lucky to have found someone so reliable," their friend Margaret Whitmore would say, looking right through me as I refilled her wine glass. "It's so hard to find good help these days. Most of them are either lazy or they steal." "Oh, Ellie's different," Veronica would respond, as if I wasn't standing right there. "She knows her place. Very respectful, very grateful for the opportunity. Aren't you, Ellie?" And I would smile and nod, because I needed that job. Because I had responsibilities they knew nothing about. Because sometimes survival means swallowing your pride and playing the role they've written for you, even when every word feels like a knife to your dignity. The worst part wasn't even the racism, though that was constant and cutting. The worst part was watching Madison and Connor absorb these attitudes, seeing them slowly learn that it was normal to treat people like me as less than human. Madison started snapping her fingers to get my attention instead of saying my name. Connor began leaving his toys scattered around, expecting me to clean up after him without being asked. I was losing them, these children I'd raised and loved, to the same poison that had infected their parents. And there was nothing I could do about it without risking everything. But I had a secret that none of them knew. A secret that had been growing stronger every day for the past 8 years, fed by every insult, every dismissal, every moment of casual cruelty they thought I was too powerless to remember. You see, before I became the Sterling family's invisible nanny, before I learned to make myself small and quiet and grateful, I had been someone else entirely. Someone with a different name, a different life, and connections that ran deeper than any of these people could imagine. And on that crisp October afternoon, when Arthur Harrington's will was read in front of Greenwich's most elite families, all of those carefully buried secrets were about to come roaring back to life. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while I was helping Connor with his homework and Madison was practicing piano. Mrs. Sterling was at her yoga class, Mr. Sterling was at the office, and Bryce and Cassandra were still sleeping off their hangover from the previous night's charity gala. "Miss Vance." The voice on the other end was crisp, professional. "This is James Morrison from Morrison, Klein and Associates. I'm calling regarding the estate of Arthur Harrington. You're requested to attend the reading of his will this Friday at 2 o'clock. My hands went numb. The pencil I'd been holding clattered to the kitchen table, and Connor looked up at me with concern. "Are you okay, Ellie? You look funny." I managed to smile at him, ruffling his hair the way I'd done 1,000 times before. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just got some unexpected news." But I wasn't fine. Arthur Harrington was dead, and somehow, impossibly, I was mentioned in his will. The man I hadn't spoken to in over a decade, the man whose existence I'd tried so hard to forget, was reaching out from beyond the grave to drag me back into a world I'd left behind. The Sterlings, of course, were beside themselves with excitement when they heard about the will reading. Arthur Harrington had been the crown jewel of Greenwich society, a reclusive billionaire whose philanthropic foundation controlled more wealth than some small countries. Everyone knew he had no direct heirs, which meant his fortune would be distributed among his friends and associates. Can you imagine? Veronica gushed to her friends over lunch, not bothering to lower her voice even though I was right there arranging flowers. "Arthur Harrington's will. We're going to be there when they announce who gets what. Richard thinks we might be in line for a substantial donation to our foundation." "I heard the Whitmore family is expecting at least $50 million, Margaret replied. "After all, they've been kissing up to that old man for decades." Bryce, lounging in his father's chair like he owned the place, laughed. "I bet even the staff gets something. Probably a few thousand each for faithful service, or whatever. Right, Ellie? Maybe you'll finally be able to afford a car that doesn't sound like it's dying." They all laughed at that, these people who'd never worked a day in their lives, mocking the idea that someone like me could ever have anything of real value. If only they knew, the days leading up to the will reading were torture in the most exquisite way. I went through my daily routines, making breakfast, driving the children to school, organizing Mrs. Sterling's calendar, while my mind raced with memories I'd spent years trying to bury. Arthur Harrington hadn't always been a reclusive billionaire. 30 years ago, when I was fresh out of Columbia Business School with my MBA and fire in my belly, he'd been my mentor, my father figure, and eventually, the man who'd broken my heart in ways I was still learning to understand. But the Sterlings knew none of this. To them, I was just Ellie the nanny, Ellie who'd somehow gotten lucky enough to be mentioned in a rich man's will. They treated my invitation like a charity case, a amusing footnote to their own anticipated windfall. "You'll need something appropriate to wear," Veronica announced Wednesday morning, looking me up and down with barely concealed disdain. "I suppose you can borrow something from my closet. We can't have you embarrassing us in front of everyone." The idea of wearing her cast-offs to claim my inheritance was so absurd I almost laughed. Instead, I nodded gratefully, playing the role they expected. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Sterling. Just remember," Bryce added, not looking up from his phone, "this isn't about you. You're there because Arthur probably left you a few $1,000s for being a good little worker. Don't get any ideas above your station." Cassandra snickered from her perch at the breakfast bar. Can you imagine? Ellie thinking she's going to get real money? She'd probably blow it all on lottery tickets and hair products. I served their breakfast in silence, my hands steady even as my heart pounded with anticipation. They had no idea they were mocking the woman who would soon control more wealth than their entire social circle combined. That afternoon, while they were all out at their various appointments and social obligations, I made a phone call I'd been avoiding for 8 years. Alara. The voice that answered was warm, familiar, tinged with an accent that spoke of old money and older secrets. My God, is it really you? Hello, James, I said, settling into the chair in my small room above the garage. It's been a long time. James Morrison had been Arthur's personal attorney for over 40 years, and one of the few people who knew the truth about my relationship with the old man. He'd been the one to help me disappear when everything fell apart, the one who'd made sure my new identity was bulletproof. I wasn't sure you'd call, he admitted. When Arthur told me to include you in the will reading, I wondered if you'd even show up. He knew where I was all this time? He's known for years. He's been keeping an eye on you, making sure you were safe, that you had what you needed. He wanted to reach out so many times, but he respected your decision to stay hidden. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of 8 years of silence pressing down on me. Why now, James? Why reveal everything now? Because he's dying, Alara. And because he finally realized that hiding you away wasn't protecting you, it was protecting everyone else from what you're capable of. The conversation lasted 2 hours. James filled me in on everything I'd missed: Arthur's declining health, the Foundation's expansion, the vultures circling his estate. He also told me about the will, about the shock that was coming, about the choice I'd have to make. Are you ready for this? He asked finally. Because once that will is read, there's no going back. Everyone will know who you really are. I looked around my small room, at the single bed, the tiny dresser, the window that looked out over the Sterling's perfectly manicured gardens. I thought about Madison and Connor, about the love I'd poured into raising them, about the way their parents had slowly poisoned them against people like me. I've been ready for 8 years, I said. Thursday night, the Sterling family hosted a pre-will reading dinner party. All of Greenwich's elite were there, speculating about Arthur's bequests, positioning themselves for whatever social reshuffling was about to occur. I served champagne and canapes while they discussed me like I wasn't there. I heard Arthur left something to his household staff, said Patricia Whitmore, Margaret's sister-in-law. Probably a few thousand each. It's sweet, really, how he remembered the little people. Ellie's been with us for 8 years, Veronica said, gesturing toward me with her champagne flute. She's very reliable. I'm sure Arthur appreciated that kind of steadiness in his employees. What did you do for Mr. Harrington, Ellie? Asked Charles Pemberton, one of Richard's golf partners. He was asking to be polite, the way you might ask a child about their finger painting. I paused in my serving, meeting his eyes directly. I helped him with various projects, sir. Administrative work, mostly. How nice, he said dismissively, already turning back to his conversation. It's wonderful when these people can find steady work. Bryce, already 3 drinks in, decided to elaborate. Ellie's great with organization. She keeps our whole house running. Don't you, Ellie? Tell them about how you manage our schedules. There was something cruel in his tone, something that made it clear this wasn't about praising my work. He wanted to display me, to show off how well-trained his family's help was. I coordinate the family's calendar and manage household operations, I said simply. See? Bryce grinned at his audience. She's like a little computer. Very efficient. We're lucky to have found someone so capable. The way he said capable made it sound like a limitation rather than a strength. Like I was a useful appliance rather than a human being with thoughts and feelings and a history that would have made his head spin. I bet Arthur left her enough to buy a nice car, Cassandra added with false sweetness. Wouldn't that be lovely, Ellie? You could finally get rid of that old Honda. They all laughed, these people who'd never worried about a car payment in their lives, who bought new vehicles the way normal people bought coffee. They found my financial struggles amusing, my gratitude for small mercies entertaining. That would be very generous, I agreed, refilling their glasses and moving on. But Margaret Whitmore wasn't done with me yet. Tell me, Ellie, she said, her voice carrying that particular tone wealthy white women use when they want to seem interested in the help. What will you do with whatever Arthur left you? Do you have family to help? Children of your own? The question hit like a physical blow. These people knew nothing about my life, about the sacrifices I'd made, about the daughter I'd lost, or the dreams I'd buried. To them, I was just a curiosity, a pet they could poke at for entertainment. I'll use whatever Mr. Harrington left me wisely, I said, my voice steady despite the pain blooming in my chest. I'm sure you will, Margaret said with patronizing kindness. It's so important for people in your position to be practical about money. No point in getting carried away with fantasies. Fantasies. As if dreaming of something better was a luxury I wasn't entitled to, as if hoping for more than scraps from their table was presumptuous. That night, after the guests had gone home and the family had retired to their rooms, I sat in my small space and pulled out a box I hadn't opened in years. Inside were photographs, documents, and memories from a life these people couldn't imagine. There was my Columbia MBA diploma, earned summa cum laude. There were photos of me in boardrooms, shaking hands with world leaders, presenting at international conferences. There was the letter Arthur had written me when I'd first joined his company, praising my exceptional analytical mind and natural leadership abilities. And there, at the bottom of the box, was the ultrasound photo I'd never been able to throw away. My daughter, Sophia, who would have been 16 now if the cancer hadn't taken her when she was 8. The reason I'd left my old life behind, the reason I'd needed to disappear into anonymity and grief. Arthur had understood. He'd been there through Sophia's illness, had paid for the best doctors, the experimental treatments, the hope that ultimately proved false. When she died, when I couldn't bear to be in the world we'd built together, he'd helped me vanish. He'd given me space to grieve, to heal, to figure out who I was without the daughter who'd been my whole world. But he'd also made me a promise. When you're ready, he'd said at Sophia's funeral, when you're strong enough to fight again, there will be a place for you. There will always be a place for you. Tomorrow, I would find out if he'd kept that promise. Friday morning dawned crisp and clear. I woke before my alarm, my body humming with nervous energy. Today was the day everything would change, the day I would step out of the shadows and reclaim the life I'd left behind. The Sterlings were in a frenzy of preparation. Veronica had changed outfits 3 times, settling on a navy Chanel suit that she felt struck the right balance between respectful mourning and hopeful anticipation. Richard practiced his surprised but gracious expression in the mirror. Bryce and Cassandra debated whether to bring their lawyer, just in case they needed immediate advice on managing their windfall. Ellie, Veronica called as I was finishing the breakfast dishes. I've laid out a dress for you on my bed. It's a few years old, but it should be appropriate. And please, try to do something with your hair. We'll all be photographed today. The dress was a shapeless black thing that would have made me look like a funeral director. I smiled and thanked her, knowing I wouldn't be wearing it. Instead, I drove to a storage unit across town, one the Sterlings knew nothing about. Inside was a wardrobe I'd maintained for 8 years, professional clothes in my real size, accessories that spoke of power rather than servitude. I selected a charcoal gray suit, Italian leather shoes, and jewelry that was understated but unmistakably expensive. When I looked in the mirror, I saw Alara Vance looking back at me. Not Ellie the nanny, not the grateful domestic worker, but the woman I'd been before grief had driven me into hiding. The woman I was about to become again. The will reading was scheduled for 2 o'clock at Morrison, Klein and Associates, the most prestigious law firm in Greenwich. I arrived separately from the Sterlings, parking my Honda between a Bentley and a Tesla, feeling like an imposter in my own life. The conference room was packed with Greenwich's elite, all dressed in their finest funeral attire, all buzzing with anticipation. The Sterlings had saved me a seat in the back, naturally, where the staff belonged. I took it without comment, watching as they worked the room schmoozing with other potential beneficiaries, positioning themselves for maximum advantage. "Ladies and gentlemen," James Morrison said, calling the room to order. "Thank you all for coming. We're here today to honor the final wishes of Arthur Harrington, a man who touched many lives and whose legacy will continue long after today." He began with the smaller bequests, donations to charities, gifts to longtime employees, sums that would have been life-changing for normal people but were pocket change to Arthur. The room grew more tense as he worked through the list, everyone waiting for their name to be called. To the Whitmore Family Foundation, James read, "I leave the sum of $10 million to be used for educational initiatives." Margaret Whitmore gasped with delight, accepting congratulations from those around her. 10 million was more than most people saw in a lifetime, but in this room, it was almost insulting. Everyone knew Arthur was worth billions. To the Sterling Family Foundation, James continued, "I leave the sum of $5 million, with the stipulation that it be used exclusively for children's programs." Veronica's face fell slightly. 5 million was nothing to sneeze at, but it was half what the Whitmores had received. Still, she smiled graciously, accepting the polite applause of the room. The bequests continued, millions here, millions there, distributed among the families and organizations that had courted Arthur's favor for decades. But everyone was waiting for the big announcement, the bulk of the estate that would make someone unimaginably wealthy. "Now," James said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "we come to the primary bequest. The controlling interest in Harrington Industries, the Harrington Foundation, and the bulk of Mr. Harrington's liquid assets, totaling approximately $12 billion. The room went dead silent. $12 billion. Enough money to buy small countries, to reshape entire industries, to wield power on a global scale. This inheritance comes with significant responsibilities, James continued. The recipient will control one of the world's largest philanthropic foundations, will oversee business interests spanning 6 continents, and will be entrusted with continuing Arthur Harrington's vision of using wealth to create positive change in the world." I could feel the tension in the room, could see people literally holding their breath. Veronica Sterling was gripping Richard's hand so tightly her knuckles were white. Margaret Whitmore was leaning forward in her chair like a sprinter waiting for the starting gun. "The sole beneficiary of this bequest," James said, his eyes finding mine across the crowded room, "is Alara Vance." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. Then, slowly, heads began to turn, looking for this Alara Vance person they'd never heard of. The confusion was palpable. Who was this mystery woman? Where was she? I stood up slowly, feeling every eye in the room track my movement. The Sterlings looked at me with complete bewilderment, still not understanding what was happening. "I'm Alara Vance," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. And that's when the real show began. The explosion of voices that followed my announcement was like nothing I'd ever heard. 37 of the most powerful families in Greenwich all talking at once, their carefully maintained composure shattered in an instant. "That's impossible." Veronica Sterling's voice cut through the chaos, shrill with disbelief. "That's our Nanny. That's Ellie." "There must be some mistake," Richard added, his face flushing red. "She works for us. She cleans our house." But James Morrison was already pulling out a thick folder, his expression calm despite the pandemonium around him. "There is no mistake. Miss Vance, would you please come forward?" I walked to the front of the room, my heels clicking against the marble floor with each step. The crowd parted before me like I was carrying a contagious disease, their faces a mixture of shock, confusion, and growing horror as they began to piece together what this meant. "For those who don't know," James said, his voice cutting through the noise, "Alara Vance was Arthur Harrington's chief operating officer from 1995 to 2016. She holds an MBA from Columbia Business School and was instrumental in building Harrington Industries into the global powerhouse it is today. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see people frantically searching their memories, trying to reconcile the woman standing before them with the invisible servant they'd been dismissing for 8 years. Margaret Whitmore was the first to find her voice. But you're the Sterling's help. You serve drinks. You clean toilets. I did many things, I said simply, including raising children whose parents were too busy with their social calendars to notice them. Bryce Sterling looked like he'd been slapped. This is insane. You're telling me our nanny is some kind of secret billionaire? That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Not secret, James corrected. Hidden. There's a difference. Miss Vance chose to step away from public life for personal reasons. Mr. Harrington respected that choice while ensuring she would always have a place to return to when she was ready. Cassandra Sterling's voice was barely a whisper. All the things we said. The realization was hitting them now, the full weight of 8 years of casual cruelty directed at someone who could have destroyed them with a phone call. I watched the color drain from their faces as they remembered every racist joke, every condescending comment, every moment they'd treated me like I was less than human. I need to see identification, demanded Charles Pemberton, clearly hoping this was all some elaborate hoax. Proof that this woman is who she claims to be. James handed me a leather portfolio. Inside were documents I hadn't seen in years. My original birth certificate, my Columbia transcripts, my employment records with Harrington Industries, and dozens of photos of me in boardrooms and at international conferences, looking every inch the powerful executive I'd once been. I passed the portfolio to Charles, watching his face change as he flipped through the evidence. This is really you, he said, his voice hollow with shock. It's really me, I confirmed. Patricia Whitmore was frantically whispering to her husband, probably calculating how much money they'd lost by treating me like garbage. We had no idea, she said finally. If we'd known who you were, you would have treated me differently, I finished. Yes, I'm sure you would have. The question is, why should that matter? Why should my bank account determine whether I deserve basic human respect? The room erupted again, everyone talking at once, trying to explain themselves, to justify years of behavior they suddenly realized had been directed at one of the most powerful women in the world. But Veronica Sterling wasn't ready to accept defeat. She stood up, her face twisted with rage and disbelief. This is fraud, she declared. I don't care what those papers say. I've known this woman for 8 years. She's a domestic worker, nothing more. She probably stole those documents, forged them somehow. Mrs. Sterling, James said patiently, I understand this is shocking, but I assure you everything is legitimate. Miss Vance's identity has been verified through multiple channels. No. Veronica's voice was getting higher, more desperate. I refuse to believe that the woman who scrubs my toilets is inheriting $12 billion while my family gets a measly $5 million. It's not possible. Actually, I said, my voice cutting through her hysteria, about that $5 million. There are conditions attached to your bequest that we haven't discussed yet. James nodded and pulled out another document. The $5 million left to the Sterling Family Foundation comes with very specific stipulations. It must be used exclusively for programs that provide educational and economic opportunities for domestic workers and their families. The foundation will be overseen by a board of trustees, chaired by Miss Vance herself. The implications hit them like a physical blow. Not only was I inheriting Arthur's fortune, but I would also be controlling how they spent their inheritance. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that they were now dependent on my approval for everything. Richard Sterling's face had gone from red to purple. This is a joke. This has to be a joke. Arthur Harrington was a respected businessman, not some social justice warrior playing games with his estate. Mr. Harrington was many things, I said, stepping closer to the Sterling family. But above all, He believed that power should be used to lift people up, not tear them down. He spent the last 8 years watching how your family treated me, and he was not impressed. You were spying on us? Bryce accused, his voice cracking with indignation. I was living with you, I corrected. There's a difference. And what I saw was a family so consumed with their own privilege that they forgot how to treat other human beings with dignity. The room was watching this exchange like a tennis match, heads swiveling back and forth between me and the Sterlings. I could see the social calculations happening in real time. Who was safe to associate with now? Which side of this conflict offered the best opportunities? Miss Vance, said a voice from the back of the room. I turned to see Jonathan Hartwell, one of Greenwich's most influential power brokers, standing with his hat literally in his hands. I want to apologize for any misunderstandings that may have occurred. If there's anything my family can do to support your transition. And there it was. The first defection. Within seconds, others were following suit, distancing themselves from the Sterlings and positioning themselves as my allies. The social hierarchy was reshuffling in real time, and everyone wanted to be on the winning side. How touching, I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. 8 years of invisibility, and suddenly everyone wants to be my friend. Margaret Whitmore stepped forward, her face flushed with embarrassment. Alara, may I call you Alara? I want you to know that I never meant any disrespect. If I said anything inappropriate. You mean like last week when you told your bridge club that these people shouldn't be allowed to drive expensive cars because we don't understand their value? I asked sweetly. Her face went white. I don't recall. Or perhaps you're thinking of the time you suggested that domestic workers should be drug tested monthly because we're all probably addicts? I continued. That was a particularly charming dinner conversation. The room was dead silent now. Everyone was remembering their own moments of casual cruelty, their own assumptions and prejudices laid bare. They were realizing that the woman they'd dismissed as invisible had been watching, listening, and remembering everything. The truth is, I said, addressing the room at large, I didn't need Arthur's money to know who you all really are. I've had a front row seat to your character for 8 years. I've seen how you treat people you think can't fight back. I've watched you raise your children to believe that wealth makes them superior to everyone else. I turned back to the Sterlings, who were huddled together like survivors of a shipwreck. And you, the family I served faithfully for 8 years, the children I loved and raised, you were the worst of all. Because you didn't just dismiss me. You made me complicit in my own degradation. You made me smile and nod while you tore apart my dignity piece by piece. Veronica was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks. We didn't know, she whispered. How could we have known? You didn't know because you never bothered to ask, I replied. In 8 years, not one of you ever asked about my education, my background, my dreams, or my losses. You saw a black woman in a uniform and decided that was all I could ever be. What do you want from us? Richard asked, his voice broken. What can we do to make this right? I looked at this family that had been my whole world for 8 years. These people I'd served and protected and loved despite their cruelty. Madison and Connor weren't here. They were at school, blissfully unaware that their world was about to change forever. I want you to understand something, I said finally. This inheritance isn't just about money. It's about power. The power to decide who gets funding for their projects, who gets invited to the important meetings, who gets to sit at the table where decisions are made. For 8 years, you had power over me. Now that dynamic has shifted. The threat was implicit but clear. I could destroy them socially, financially, professionally. I could make them pariahs in their own community, could ensure that their foundation never received another donation, could turn their friends against them with a few well-placed words. Please, Cassandra whispered. We have children. We have responsibilities. So did I said quietly. I had a daughter once. Her name was Sophia, and she died of leukemia when she was 8 years old. Arthur paid for her treatment, held my hand through the worst moments of my life, and when I couldn't bear to continue in the world we'd built together, he helped me disappear. He gave me space to grieve, to heal, to find a new purpose. The room was completely silent now. Even the lawyers had stopped shuffling papers. I found that purpose in your children, I continued, my voice thick with emotion. Madison and Connor became my second chance at motherhood. I poured all the love I couldn't give to Sophia into raising them. And you made jokes about my car while I was grieving the daughter I'd lost. You mocked my gratitude while I was trying to rebuild my shattered heart. Veronica was sobbing openly now. We're sorry. We're so sorry. Sorry isn't enough, I said. Sorry doesn't undo 8 years of systematic humiliation. Sorry doesn't erase the damage you've done to your own children by teaching them that people like me don't matter. I turned to address the room one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, you're looking at the new face of the Harrington Foundation. Over the next few months, we'll be conducting a comprehensive review of all our partnerships and funding decisions. We'll be asking hard questions about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We'll be examining whether the organizations we support truly reflect the values Arthur Harrington believed in. The implications were staggering. Most of these families depended on Harrington Foundation funding for their pet projects and social initiatives. I was essentially announcing that their access to billions of dollars would now depend on their ability to prove they weren't the bigots I knew them to be. The meeting is adjourned, James announced. Miss Vance, if you could stay behind, we have some paperwork to complete. As the room began to empty, people filed past me with a mixture of fear and desperate hope in their eyes. Some tried to catch my attention, to offer congratulations or apologies. Others couldn't even look at me, too ashamed of their past behavior to meet my gaze. The Sterlings were the last to leave. They stood by the door like lost children, clearly wanting to say something but not knowing what words could possibly bridge the chasm that had opened between us. Elara, Veronica said finally, her voice barely audible. The children, Madison and Connor, they love you. Whatever happens between us, please don't punish them for our mistakes. It was the first time she'd ever acknowledged that I might have feelings, that my relationship with her children might matter to me as much as it did to them. I would never hurt those children, I said. But I won't continue to enable their parents' behavior either. Things are going to change, Veronica. The question is whether you're willing to change with them. They left without another word, and I was alone with James and the weight of $12 billion in responsibility. How do you feel? James asked as he began organizing the paperwork. I looked out the window at Greenwich's perfectly manicured streets, at the world of privilege and power that had just been turned upside down. Like I'm about to find out who I really am, I said. Arthur would be proud, James said softly. He always believed you'd come back stronger. I'm not the same person who left, I warned him. 8 years of invisibility changes you. 8 years of watching people's true nature when they think no one important is looking. It hardens something inside you. Good, James said firmly. The world doesn't need another polite billionaire. It needs someone who understands what it's like to be powerless, someone who remembers what it feels like to be dismissed and degraded. Arthur knew that. That's why he chose you. As I signed document after document, transferring control of an empire into my hands, I thought about the choice that lay ahead of me. I could use this power for revenge, could systematically destroy everyone who'd wronged me. Or I could use it for something bigger, something that would honor both Arthur's memory and Sophia's legacy. But first, I had to go home. I had to face Madison and Connor, had to figure out how to explain to 2 children that the woman who'd raised them was not who they thought she was. I had to decide whether the Sterling family deserved redemption or destruction. The sun was setting as I drove back to Sterling Manor in my old Honda, $12 billion richer than I'd been that morning, but somehow feeling more uncertain than ever. The house looked the same from the outside, but everything had changed. I was no longer the help returning from an errand. I was the most powerful woman in Greenwich, coming home to decide the fate of the family that had never seen me as anything more than a servant. The real test was about to begin. The Sterling mansion felt different when I walked through the front door that evening. The same marble floors, the same crystal chandelier, the same family portraits staring down from the walls, but now I saw it all through different eyes. This wasn't the house where I worked anymore. This was just another piece of real estate in a world I now controlled. Madison and Connor were in the living room doing homework when I entered. They looked up with their usual bright smiles, completely unaware that their universe had shifted on its axis. "Ellie," Connor called out, running over to hug my legs the way he'd done since he was 6. "How was the boring lawyer meeting? Did you get some money?" The innocence in his question nearly broke my heart. "Something like that," I said, ruffling his hair. "Where are your parents?" "Mom's in her room crying," Madison said matter-of-factly. She was 13 now, old enough to sense when something was wrong but not old enough to understand what. "Dad's in his office making angry phone calls." And Bryce and Cassandra left in a big hurry. They took a lot of suitcases. So they were already running. I wasn't surprised. Bryce had never been one to face consequences when he could avoid them instead. "Are you okay, Ellie?" Madison asked, studying my face with the perceptiveness that had always made her special. "You look different. Different." If only she knew how different everything was about to become. "I'm fine, sweetheart. But we need to talk, all of us. Can you ask your parents to come downstairs?" The family meeting that followed was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. We sat in the same living room where I'd served countless dinner parties, where I'd been dismissed and degraded for 8 years. But now the power dynamic had completely reversed. Veronica had clearly been crying for hours. Her usually perfect makeup was smeared, her hair disheveled. Richard looked like he'd aged a decade in the span of an afternoon. They sat on the edge of their expensive sofa like defendants waiting for a verdict. "Children," I began, choosing my words carefully, "there are some things about me that you don't know. Some things I haven't been able to tell you until now. Are you in trouble?" Connor asked, his 8-year-old mind jumping to the worst conclusion he could imagine. "No, baby. I'm not in trouble. But my life is about to change in some big ways, and that means your life might change too." I spent the next hour explaining as gently as I could. I told them about my education, about my previous career, about the daughter I'd lost, and the grief that had driven me into hiding. I watched their faces change as they processed this information, saw the confusion and hurt in their eyes as they realized the woman they'd known wasn't exactly who they'd thought she was. "So you're rich now?" Madison asked finally. "Very rich," I confirmed. "Richer than us?" Connor wanted to know. "Much richer." They absorbed this in the way children do, with a mixture of excitement and concern. "Does this mean you're going to leave us?" Madison asked, and the fear in her voice nearly undid me. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "That depends on a lot of things." Richard cleared his throat. "Elara, can I call you Elara? I want you to know how sorry we are. If we'd known." "But you didn't know because you never asked," I interrupted. "In 8 years, Richard, you never once asked me about my life outside this house. None of you did." "We're asking now," Veronica said desperately. "We want to know. We want to understand." "Do you?" I challenged. "Or do you just want to manage the damage?" Because there's a difference. The next few days were a masterclass in watching people's true nature emerge under pressure. Word of my inheritance had spread through Greenwich like wildfire, and suddenly everyone wanted to be my best friend. My phone, which had barely rung in 8 years, was now buzzing constantly. Invitations to charity galas, requests for meetings, offers of friendship from people who'd looked right through me just days before. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Margaret Whitmore showed up at the house on Saturday morning with a fruit basket and a smile so forced it looked painful. "Elara, darling," she gushed, air-kissing me like we were old friends. "I've been thinking about our conversation at the will reading, and I realize there may have been some misunderstandings. I'd love to take you to lunch, just the two of us, so we can clear the air. What misunderstandings? I asked innocently. Her smile faltered slightly. Well, you know how these things can be taken out of context. I'm sure I never meant anything offensive. You mean like when you said domestic workers should be drug tested because we're probably all addicts? Or when you suggested we shouldn't be allowed to drive nice cars because we don't understand their value? The color drained from her face. Those were private conversations. I never meant. You never meant for me to hear them, I finished. But I did hear them, Margaret. I heard every word. She left without her fruit basket. The Sterlings, meanwhile, were walking on eggshells around me. They'd clearly had family meetings about how to handle the situation because their behavior had changed overnight. Suddenly, they were asking about my day, offering to help with tasks I'd been doing alone for years, treating me with a deference that felt more insulting than their previous dismissal. Elara, Veronica said on Sunday morning, I was thinking we should redecorate your room. Make it more suitable for someone of your stature. My stature. Well, you know, you're not really the help anymore, are you? You're more like family. Family. After 8 years of being treated like furniture, now I was family because I had money. I'm the same person I was last week, I said. The only thing that's changed is your perception of my bank account. That's not true, she protested. We always valued you. We didn't know how to show it properly. The lies were coming easier now, the revisionist history that would let them sleep at night. They were rewriting 8 years of casual cruelty into a story where they'd always respected me, where the problem had been communication rather than character. But the children were different. Madison and Connor were struggling with the revelation in their own ways, trying to reconcile the Ellie they'd known with the Elara they were learning about. Were you pretending to be our nanny? Connor asked one evening as I was helping him with his math homework. No, baby. I was your nanny. That part was real. Everything I felt for you, everything we shared, that was all real. But you were lying about who you were. The accusation stung because it wasn't entirely wrong. I was protecting myself, I said. Sometimes adults have to keep parts of their lives private to stay safe. Safe from what? How do you explain to an 8-year-old that you were hiding from grief so profound it had nearly destroyed you? How do you tell a child that their parents' casual racism had made you feel unsafe in ways they couldn't understand? Safe from people who might hurt me if they knew the truth, I said finally. Madison, who'd been listening from the doorway, stepped into the room. Like my parents? The question hung in the air between us. These children were smart enough to sense the tension, old enough to remember years of their parents' casual cruelty toward me. They were starting to understand that the adults in their lives weren't who they'd thought they were. Your parents never meant to hurt me, I said carefully. But sometimes people say and do things that are hurtful without realizing it. That's not true, Madison said quietly. I heard Mom and her friends talking about you lots of times. They knew it was mean. They just didn't care because they thought you couldn't do anything about it. The wisdom in her words was devastating. At 13, she already understood power dynamics better than most adults. She'd watched her parents' behavior and drawn her own conclusions about their character. What happens now? She asked. Are you going to punish them? It was the question everyone was asking in one form or another. The entire Greenwich social scene was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do with my newfound power. Would I be magnanimous or vengeful? Would I forgive or destroy? I don't know yet, I told her honestly. I'm still figuring that out. The pressure was building from all sides. James Morrison called daily with updates on foundation business, decisions that needed to be made, meetings that required my attention. The Harrington Empire was vast and complex, with tentacles reaching into every corner of the global economy. Arthur had built something magnificent, and now it was mine to steward. But I was also getting pressure from unexpected sources. Other domestic workers in Greenwich had somehow gotten my number and were calling to share their own stories of mistreatment. Women who'd been cleaning houses and raising other people's children for decades, all of them with tales of casual cruelty and systematic dehumanization. Miss Vance said a woman named Rosa who worked for the Pemberton family. I heard what happened at that meeting. I just wanted you to know. What you did, standing up like that, it gave me hope. Hope for what? Hope that maybe things can change. That maybe our children won't have to clean up after people who think we're nothing. The weight of representation was crushing. I wasn't just responsible for my own choices anymore. I was carrying the hopes and dreams of every woman who'd ever been dismissed, degraded, or dehumanized because of her race, her class, or her occupation. Meanwhile, the Sterling family was fracturing under the pressure. Bryce and Cassandra had fled to her parents' house in the Hamptons, but even there they weren't safe from the social fallout. Word was spreading through their entire network about how they'd treated me, and suddenly invitations were being rescinded, business deals were falling through, and friends were distancing themselves. "They're destroying us," Veronica sobbed to Richard one evening, not knowing I was in the next room. "Everyone's talking about how we treated her. The Whitmores canceled our dinner plans. The country club is reviewing our membership. Even the children's schools are asking questions. What did you expect?" Richard snapped back. "We humiliated one of the most powerful women in the world for 8 years. Did you think there wouldn't be consequences? But we didn't know. That's the problem, Veronica. We didn't know because we didn't care enough to find out. We saw a black woman in a uniform and decided that was all she could ever be." It was the first time I'd heard Richard acknowledge the racial component of their behavior, the first time either of them had admitted that their treatment of me had been rooted in prejudice rather than just class differences. The conversation continued, and I learned things about their marriage, their finances, and their fears that I'd never known. They were more vulnerable than they'd ever let on, more dependent on their social connections and foundation funding than I'd realized. My inheritance hadn't just shifted the power dynamic between us, it had exposed how precarious their entire lifestyle really was. But it was a conversation between Madison and Connor that finally crystallized my decision about what to do next. I was walking past Madison's room when I heard them talking, their voices low and serious in the way children's voices get when they're trying to solve adult problems. "Do you think Ellie hates us now?" Connor asked. "I don't think she hates us," Madison replied. "But I think she's disappointed in Mom and Dad. And I think maybe she should be." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've been thinking about all the things they said about her over the years. All the jokes they made, all the times they treated her like she was stupid or lazy or less than us. And I'm starting to realize that wasn't okay." "But she was just the nanny." "No, Connor. She was never just anything. She was a person with feelings and thoughts and a whole life we never bothered to learn about. And Mom and Dad, they made her feel small on purpose. Why would they do that? Because it made them feel big." The insight from a 13-year-old was more profound than anything the adults in this house had managed to articulate. Madison understood something her parents were still struggling to grasp, that their treatment of me hadn't been about my worth, but about their need to feel superior. "I think," Madison continued, "that Ellie is trying to decide if we're worth saving. If our family can change enough to deserve her forgiveness." "And what do you think?" There was a long pause before Madison answered. "I think we have to prove it. I think we have to show her that we can be better than we were." That night, I made my decision. Not about forgiveness. That would take time if it came at all. But about what came next, about how I would use the power Arthur had entrusted to me. I called James Morrison and scheduled a press conference for the following week. It was time to step fully into my new role, to announce my plans for the Harrington Foundation and my vision for how wealth should be used in the modern world. But first, I had one more conversation to have with the Sterling family. One final chance to see if they were capable of the kind of change Madison believed was possible. The reckoning was coming, and everyone would have to choose which side of history they wanted to be on, The conversation I'd been dreading came on a Tuesday evening, exactly 1 week after the will reading. I'd called a family meeting, and we sat in the same living room where I'd served their guests for 8 years, where I'd been invisible while they planned their lives around money that was never going to be theirs. But this time, I wasn't serving anyone. This time, I was the one with the power to change everything. I've made some decisions, I began, looking at each of them in turn. About the foundation, about my future, and about this family. Veronica's hands were shaking as she reached for her wine glass. Richard sat rigid in his chair, like a man waiting for a death sentence. Madison and Connor flanked me on the sofa, and I could feel their tension even though they were trying to be brave. First, I want you to understand something about the money Arthur left you. $5 million sounds like a lot, but it comes with conditions that go far beyond what James read at the will meeting. I pulled out a folder I'd been carrying for days, documents that would reshape their understanding of their inheritance. The funding is contingent on the Sterling Family Foundation meeting specific diversity and inclusion benchmarks. You'll need to hire staff that reflects the communities you claim to serve. You'll need to partner with organizations led by people of color. And every program you fund will be subject to review by a board that I control. That's reasonable, Richard said carefully. I'm not finished. I opened the folder and spread the documents across the coffee table. There's also a personal conduct clause. Any member of the Sterling family who engages in discriminatory behavior, who makes racist or classist comments, or who treats service workers with disrespect will trigger an immediate review of the entire bequest. Veronica's face went white. You're talking about monitoring our private conversations? I'm talking about accountability, I corrected. For 8 years, you thought your private conversations were consequence-free because you believed I was powerless. Now you know better. But how would you even know if we? Bryce's voice trailed off as he realized what he was asking. If you what? If you go back to making racist jokes the moment you think I'm not listening? If you start treating your next housekeeper the way you treated me? I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Let's just say I have friends in this community now. People who've been invisible for years, but who see and hear everything. The implications were staggering. I wasn't just talking about monitoring their behavior. I was talking about building a network of domestic workers, gardeners, drivers, and service staff who could report back on how Greenwich's elite families really behaved behind closed doors. You're talking about spying, Richard said, his voice hollow. I'm talking about transparency. For decades, families like yours have hidden behind closed doors, treating people like me as subhuman while maintaining your public reputations as philanthropists and community leaders. That era is over. Madison spoke up for the first time. What about us? Connor and me? Are we being punished too? The pain in her voice nearly broke my resolve. These children had been caught in the crossfire of their parents' prejudices, raised to see inequality as natural and hierarchy as inevitable. But they were still young enough to change, still capable of becoming better than the people who'd raised them. You're not being punished, I said gently. But you're being given a choice. You can continue to live in this house, continue to benefit from your family's wealth, but only if you're willing to learn and grow. Only if you're willing to see people like me as fully human. We do see you as human, Connor protested. We love you, Ellie. I know you do, baby. But love isn't enough if it doesn't come with respect. And respect means understanding that I was never just the nanny. I was a woman with a PhD in economics, with decades of business experience, with a heart broken by loss, and a mind sharp enough to build empires. Your parents saw none of that because they chose not to see it. Veronica was crying again, but this time her tears felt different. Less self-pity, more genuine remorse. We failed you, she whispered. We failed our children. We failed ourselves. Yes, I said simply. You did. Is there any way to make it right? I looked at this woman who'd humiliated me countless times, who'd made racist jokes at dinner parties while I served her guests, who'd treated me like a piece of furniture for 8 years. Part of me wanted to destroy her completely, to use my new power to ensure she never felt safe or comfortable again. But another part of me remembered Madison and Connor, remembered the love I'd poured into raising them, remembered that revenge might feel good in the moment, but wouldn't honor the memory of my daughter or the vision Arthur had for his foundation. I don't know, I said honestly, but I'm willing to find out. The next morning brought news that changed everything. James Morrison called at 6 a.m., his voice tight with urgency. Alara, we have a problem. Someone leaked details about your inheritance to the press. Not just the amount, everything. Your background, your time with the Sterlings, even information about Sophia. My blood ran cold. How much do they know? Everything. There's going to be a story in tomorrow's Greenwich Times with the headline, From Nanny to Billionaire, The Secret Life of Alara Vance. They have quotes from former colleagues, photos from your Columbia graduation, even medical records from Sophia's treatment. I sank into a chair, my mind racing. Who would have access to all that information? That's what we need to figure out. But Alara, there's more. The story doesn't just focus on your success. It goes into detail about how the Sterling family treated you. Specific incidents, exact quotes from dinner parties, even recordings. Recordings. Someone's been documenting their behavior for years. Phone calls, dinner conversations, private family meetings. It's all there, and it's all going to be public tomorrow. The room started spinning. Someone had been watching the Sterlings the way they'd never bothered to watch me. Someone had been building a case, collecting evidence, waiting for the right moment to destroy them completely. James, I need you to find out who's behind this. And I need you to stop that story from running. I'm not sure we can. The paper's already gone to print. But Alara, there's something else. The recordings don't just implicate the Sterlings. They have conversations from other families too. The Whitmores, the Pembertons, half of Greenwich's social elite. Someone's been systematically documenting how this entire community treats their domestic staff. I hung up the phone and sat in the silence of my small room, trying to process what this meant. In less than 24 hours, the private cruelties of Greenwich's most powerful families would be public knowledge. The casual racism, the classist jokes, the systematic dehumanization of an entire class of workers, all of it would be exposed. And somehow, I was at the center of it all. The Sterling family was in chaos when the story broke. I found them huddled around Richard's computer in his office, reading the article with expressions of absolute horror. The headline was even worse than James had warned: Billionaire's Revenge, How Greenwich's Elite Tormented Their Secret Heiress. The article was devastating in its thoroughness. It detailed every humiliation, every racist joke, every moment of casual cruelty I'd endured over 8 years. But more than that, it painted a picture of systematic abuse that went far beyond one family. Listen to this, Richard read aloud, his voice shaking. In one recorded conversation from 2019, Veronica Sterling can be heard telling guests that domestic workers should be grateful for any employment because most of them are probably illegal immigrants anyway. When a guest suggested this was inappropriate, Sterling laughed and said, "What are they going to do about it? They need us more than we need them." Veronica made it sound like a wounded animal. "I don't remember saying that." "But you did say it," Madison said quietly. "I remember that dinner party. I was doing homework in the next room, and I heard you." The article continued with similar revelations about other families. Margaret Whitmore caught on tape saying domestic workers shouldn't be allowed to use the main bathrooms because you never know what diseases they might have. Charles Pemberton recorded making jokes about his housekeeper's accent and intelligence. Family after family exposed for behavior that revealed the ugly truth beneath Greenwich's polished surface. But the most damaging revelations were about the Sterling family's treatment of me specifically. The article detailed how they'd withheld bonuses, demanded unpaid overtime, and made me work through illness. It described dinner parties where I'd been forced to serve guests who made racist jokes about me while I stood right there. The most heartbreaking detail, the article continued, is that Vance was grieving the loss of her 8-year-old daughter throughout much of her employment with the Sterlings. Medical records show that Sophia Vance died of leukemia in 2015, just months before Alara began working for the family. Rather than offering support or understanding, the Sterlings frequently mocked Vance's emotional state, with Bryce Sterling once suggesting she was too dramatic and needed to get over whatever was bothering her. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched the color drain from their faces as they realized the full scope of their cruelty. They hadn't just been dismissing their employee, they'd been tormenting a grieving mother. "Ellie," Connor whispered, "you had a little girl?" I knelt down to his level, seeing my own pain reflected in his 8-year-old eyes. "I did, baby. Her name was Sophia, and she would have loved you and Madison so much. Is that why you were always sad sometimes? When you thought we weren't looking?" The perceptiveness of children never ceased to amaze me. "Yes, sweetheart. That's why." Madison was crying now, understanding flooding her teenage mind. "All those times Mom and Dad said you were being dramatic or emotional, you were missing your daughter." "I was missing my daughter," I confirmed. Veronica collapsed into a chair, the weight of her actions finally hitting her. "Oh God. Oh my God, what have we done?" But the revelations weren't finished. The article's final section detailed the systematic nature of the abuse, suggesting that Greenwich's elite families had created an informal network of information sharing about domestic workers, warning each other about employees who were too uppity or didn't know their place. Most disturbing of all, the article concluded, is evidence that these families actively worked to keep domestic workers isolated and powerless. They shared information about employees who asked for raises or time off, effectively blacklisting anyone who dared to advocate for themselves. The system was designed to ensure that people like Alara Vance remained invisible, voiceless, and completely dependent on their employer's goodwill. The phone started ringing immediately. Reporters, lawyers, advocacy groups, government officials, everyone wanted a statement from the woman at the center of the story. But I wasn't ready to talk to anyone yet. I was still trying to process the fact that someone had been documenting everything, building a case that would expose not just the Sterling family, but an entire system of exploitation. "Who do you think did this?" Richard asked, his voice hollow. I had my suspicions, but I wasn't ready to share them yet. "Someone who's been watching and waiting for the right moment to act." "What happens now?" Veronica asked. I looked at this family that had been my whole world for 8 years, these people who'd shaped my daily existence while never truly seeing me. They were broken now, exposed and humiliated in the most public way possible. Their social standing was destroyed, their reputation in ruins, their future uncertain. Part of me felt vindicated. After years of powerlessness, watching them face consequences for their actions was deeply satisfying. But another part of me felt something unexpected: pity. They were small people who'd been given too much power, and they'd used it to make themselves feel bigger by making others feel smaller. "Now," I said, "we find out who we really are when everything else is stripped away." The devastation was complete. By evening, the Sterling family's phones had been disconnected, their social media accounts flooded with angry comments, their business relationships severed. The foundation funding I controlled was their only lifeline, and everyone knew it. But the story had implications far beyond one family's downfall. It had exposed a system of exploitation that reached into every corner of Greenwich's elite society. And somehow, I'd become the face of a reckoning that was much bigger than my personal revenge. The question now was what I would do with the power I'd been given. Would I use it to destroy the people who'd wronged me, or would I use it to build something better? The answer would determine not just my future, but the future of everyone who'd ever been invisible in a world that refused to see them. The aftermath of the article's publication was swift and merciless. Within 48 hours, The Sterling family's world had completely collapsed, and I watched it happen from the eye of the hurricane I'd somehow become the center of. The first blow came from Richard's business partners. Sterling and Associates, the investment firm he'd built over 20 years, lost 3 major clients before noon on the day the story broke. By evening, his remaining partners had called an emergency meeting to discuss restructuring the leadership team, corporate speak for forcing him out of his own company. "They're saying I'm a liability," Richard told Veronica that night, his voice hollow as he stared at the termination papers spread across his desk. 20 years of building this firm, and they're throwing me out because of a newspaper article. "It's not just a newspaper article," Veronica replied, her own voice brittle with exhaustion. "It's proof that we're exactly the kind of people everyone suspected we were but were too polite to say." I was in the kitchen, supposedly preparing dinner, but actually listening to their conversation through the thin walls. The house felt different now, smaller somehow, as if the weight of their shame was pressing down on everything. The social exile was even more brutal than the professional consequences. The Greenwich Country Club, where the Sterlings had been members for 15 years, sent a formal letter requesting their voluntary resignation to avoid the embarrassment of a public expulsion. Charity boards that had courted Veronica's involvement suddenly discovered conflicts of interest that made her participation impossible. Dinner invitations dried up overnight, and former friends crossed the street to avoid awkward conversations. But it was the impact on Madison and Connor that truly broke my heart. "The kids at school are saying terrible things," Madison told me on Thursday evening, her 13-year-old composure finally cracking. "They're calling us racists and saying we tortured you. Some of them won't even talk to me anymore." Connor, who was too young to fully understand the social dynamics, but old enough to sense the rejection, had started having nightmares. "Why is everyone mad at us, Ellie? What did we do wrong? How do you explain to an 8-year-old that he's paying the price for his parents' cruelty? How do you tell a child that the comfortable world he's always known was built on the systematic dehumanization of people like me?" "You didn't do anything wrong, baby," I said, pulling him onto my lap the way I'd done countless times before. "But sometimes when adults make bad choices, it affects everyone around them." "Are you going to leave us?" he asked, his voice small and scared. The question I'd been dreading. "I don't know yet." "Please don't leave," Madison said, sitting down beside us. "I know Mom and Dad were horrible to you. I know we don't deserve your forgiveness. But you're the only stable thing in our lives. If you go..." She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. These children had already lost their social standing, their father's business, their mother's charity work, and their family's reputation. If they lost me too, they'd have nothing left. The financial pressure was mounting as well. Without Richard's income from the firm, without Veronica's board positions and speaking fees, without the social connections that had generated business opportunities, the Sterling family was facing a cash flow crisis that would have been unthinkable just weeks before. "We might have to sell the house," I overheard Richard telling Veronica on Friday night. "The mortgage payments alone are more than we can handle without my partnership income." "Sell the house?" Veronica's voice was panicked. "This house is everything. It's our identity, our status, our children's inheritance. Our children's inheritance is $5 million that we can't access unless we meet conditions set by the woman we spent 8 years humiliating," Richard replied bitterly. "And even if we do meet those conditions, it's foundation money. We can't use it for personal expenses." The irony wasn't lost on me. For 8 years, they'd lived in luxury while paying me a fraction of what I was worth, confident that their wealth made them untouchable. Now they were discovering how quickly privilege could evaporate when the social structures that supported it were stripped away. But the cruelest blow came from an unexpected source: their own son. Bryce had been hiding in the Hamptons since the story broke, but on Saturday morning he published a statement on social media that sent shockwaves through what remained of the Sterling family's world. I want to publicly apologize to Alara Vance for my family's unconscionable treatment of her over the past 8 years, the statement read. As someone who participated in and benefited from this systematic abuse, I take full responsibility for my actions. However, I want to make it clear that the primary architects of this cruelty were my parents, Richard and Veronica Sterling, whose racist and classist attitudes created a toxic environment that I was too weak to challenge. The statement continued for several paragraphs, detailing specific incidents of abuse while positioning Bryce as a reluctant participant rather than an enthusiastic perpetrator. He threw his parents under the bus completely, painting himself as a victim of their influence while simultaneously distancing himself from their fate. Effective immediately, the statement concluded, I am severing all financial and personal ties with my parents. Cassandra and I will be starting fresh, building a life based on the values of equality and respect that my parents never taught me. I hope that Alara Vance can find it in her heart to forgive a young man who was raised in ignorance, but is committed to doing better. Veronica read the statement aloud in the living room, her voice breaking with each word. When she finished, the silence was deafening. He's abandoning us, she whispered. Our own son is abandoning us to save himself. Can you blame him? Richard asked, but there was no fight left in his voice. We're toxic now. Anyone associated with us is guilty by association. But we're his parents. We raised him, loved him, gave him everything. We also taught him that people like Alara were beneath us, Richard replied. We taught him that wealth and status mattered more than character. Now he's using those same lessons to cut us loose. I watched this family disintegrate in real time, their bonds of love and loyalty proving no match for the pressure of public shame and financial ruin. The people who'd once seemed so powerful, so untouchable, were revealing themselves to be as fragile as anyone else when their support systems collapsed. The media attention was relentless. Reporters camped outside the house. Photographers with long lenses tried to capture images through the windows, and news vans lined the street like an occupying army. The Sterling family had become a symbol of everything wrong with America's wealthy elite, and the public's appetite for their downfall seemed insatiable. Greenwich's shame, how one family's cruelty exposed a system of abuse, read the headline in the New York Times. The Nanny's Revenge, a Billionaire's Justice, proclaimed the Washington Post. From servant to sovereign, the Alara Vance story, announced Forbes. Every article painted me as a hero and the Sterlings as villains, but the reality was more complicated than the media narrative suggested. Yes, they'd been cruel and racist and classist. Yes, they'd systematically dehumanized me for 8 years. But they were also broken people who'd been raised in a system that taught them their worth came from their ability to look down on others. The breaking point came on Sunday evening, exactly 1 week after the article's publication. I found Veronica in Madison's room, sitting on the bed and staring at the wall with empty eyes. She'd been there for hours, Madison told me, not speaking, barely moving, just existing in a state of complete emotional collapse. Mrs. Sterling? I said gently. Veronica. She turned to look at me, and I was shocked by what I saw. This woman who'd always been perfectly put together, who'd prided herself on her appearance and social grace, looked like she'd aged a decade in a week. Her hair was unwashed, her clothes wrinkled, her eyes red and swollen from crying. I keep thinking about your daughter, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Sophia. I keep imagining what it would feel like to lose Madison or Connor, and then I remember all the times we mocked your grief. All the times we told you to get over whatever was bothering you. She started crying again, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere primal. We tortured a grieving mother for 8 years, and we thought it was funny. What kind of people does that make us? I sat down beside her on Madison's bed, in the room where I'd read countless bedtime stories and dried countless tears. It makes you people who lost their way, I said finally. Can we find our way back? I don't know. But you can't do it from a place of self-pity. You can't rebuild your character while you're still focused on what you've lost. Everything's gone, she said. Our friends, our reputation, our livelihood, our son. Even our children look at us differently now. Madison barely speaks to us, and Connor keeps asking why everyone's angry. We've lost everything that mattered to us. No, I said firmly. You've lost everything that you thought mattered to you. Your children are still here. Your health is still intact. You still have a roof over your heads and food on your table. You still have the possibility of redemption if you're willing to do the work. What work? The morning of the press conference, I found them all in the kitchen, picking at breakfast they couldn't taste while the weight of their uncertain future pressed down on them like a physical force. I'm making an announcement today, I told them. About the foundation, about my plans, and about this family. Veronica's hands started shaking. Are you going to destroy us completely? I'm going to tell the truth, I said. All of it. The community center was packed beyond capacity. Every major news outlet had sent reporters, and the crowd included everyone from domestic workers' rights advocates to Greenwich's remaining social elite, all of them hungry to hear what the woman at the center of this scandal would say next. I walked to the podium in a navy blue suit that had been custom-tailored for this moment, my head high and my voice steady as I looked out at the sea of faces. Some were sympathetic, some were hostile, and some were simply curious about what would happen when someone who'd been invisible for 8 years suddenly commanded the attention of the entire world. My name is Alara Vance, I began, and for the past 8 years, most of you have known me as Ellie, the Sterling family's nanny and housekeeper. Today, I want to tell you who I really am, why I chose to hide in plain sight, and what I plan to do with the power that Arthur Harrington has entrusted to me. I started with Sophia, with the daughter whose death had shattered my world and driven me into hiding. I showed them pictures of her bright smile and curious eyes, told them about her love of books and her dreams of becoming a scientist. I made her real for an audience that had only known her as a footnote in a scandal. When Sophia died, I continued, I couldn't bear to continue in the world Arthur and I had built together. Every boardroom reminded me of the future she'd never have. Every business decision felt meaningless without her laughter to come home to. So I disappeared, choosing to grieve in anonymity while I figured out how to live in a world without my daughter. The room was completely silent, the weight of a mother's grief settling over the crowd like a blanket. I took the job with the Sterling family because I needed to be needed again. I needed to pour my love into children who would benefit from the care I could no longer give to Sophia. And for 8 years, Madison and Connor Sterling became my second chance at motherhood. I paused, letting that sink in before continuing with the harder truths. But their parents saw something very different when they looked at me. They saw a black woman in a uniform, and they decided that was all I could ever be. They never asked about my education, my background, or my dreams. They never wondered why a woman with a PhD in economics was cleaning their toilets, or why someone with decades of business experience was content to fold their laundry. The crowd was shifting uncomfortably now, recognizing themselves in the behavior I was describing. For 8 years, I listened to racist jokes at dinner parties. I endured condescending comments about my intelligence and my worth. I was told I should be grateful for the opportunity to serve people who considered themselves my superiors in every way that mattered. I pulled out a folder and opened it on the podium. But I wasn't just listening. I was documenting. Every cruel comment, every racist joke, every moment of casual dehumanization. I recorded it all. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. This was the revelation no one had been expecting. You see, I may have been grieving, but I never stopped being a businesswoman. I never stopped understanding the value of information and the power of evidence. And I knew that someday, when I was ready to reclaim my life, I would need proof of what I'd endured. I activated the large screen behind me, and suddenly the room was filled with audio recordings of the Sterling family and their friends. Veronica's voice, clear as day, making jokes about these people and their supposed limitations. Bryce laughing about my old car and suggesting I was too stupid to handle money responsibly. Richard dismissing my work as basic housekeeping while I managed every aspect of their complex household. But the most damaging recordings weren't of the Sterlings at all. They were of other families, other dinner parties, other moments when Greenwich's elite thought they were safe to reveal their true feelings about the people who served them. Margaret Whitmore, recorded at a charity luncheon in 2019, I announced as her voice filled the room. The problem with hiring these people is that they always want more money. They don't understand that they should be grateful for any job at all. Charles Pemberton, recorded at a golf club dinner in 2020, I continued as his voice played next. I told my wife we should drug test the cleaning lady. You know how these people are with substances. Family after family, voice after voice, a systematic documentation of the casual cruelty that defined how Greenwich's wealthy elite really felt about the people who made their comfortable lives possible. The room was in chaos now, people shouting denials, others demanding to know how I'd obtained the recordings, still others trying to leave before their own voices might be played. But I wasn't finished. I want to be clear about something, I said, my voice cutting through the noise. I didn't record these conversations to seek revenge. I recorded them because I knew that someday, someone would need proof that this behavior was real, systematic, and widespread. I recorded them because I knew that without evidence, people like you would simply deny that any of this ever happened. The screen behind me changed to show financial documents, employment records, and legal filings that painted a picture of systematic wage theft and labor violations across dozens of Greenwich households. The Harrington Foundation has commissioned a comprehensive study of domestic worker treatment in affluent communities across Connecticut, I announced. What we've found is a pattern of abuse that goes far beyond individual families. We've documented wage theft, illegal working conditions, sexual harassment, and systematic discrimination that affects thousands of workers across the state. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about the Sterling family anymore. This was about an entire system of exploitation that had operated in the shadows for decades. But I'm not here today to destroy anyone, I continued, and the room fell silent again. I'm here to offer a choice. The Harrington Foundation is launching a new initiative called the Dignity at Work program. We will provide funding, training, and support to help wealthy families learn how to treat their domestic workers with respect and fairness. I looked directly at the section where the Sterling family was sitting, their faces pale with shock and hope. Families who participate in this program will receive support in restructuring their employment practices, training in cultural competency and unconscious bias, and ongoing monitoring to ensure compliance with fair labor standards. In return, they will have access to foundation funding for their charitable initiatives and a path toward rebuilding their reputations. The offer was unprecedented. Instead of using my power to destroy the people who'd wronged me, I was offering them a chance at redemption, but only if they were willing to do the hard work of becoming better people. More importantly, they'd had to face their children's disappointment and work to rebuild relationships that had been damaged by years of casual cruelty. Ellie, Connor said, looking up from his math worksheet, "Can you check this problem?" Dad tried to help, but he got confused. I smiled, remembering how Richard used to dismiss my intelligence while I managed every complex aspect of his household. Now he regularly asked for my help with business decisions and deferred to my expertise on financial matters. The man who'd once treated me like furniture now sought my advice on everything from investment strategies to parenting decisions. "Let me see," I said, sitting down beside him. The math was simple enough, but I took my time explaining it, savoring these moments of normalcy that had once seemed impossible. Madison looked up from her own homework. Mom called. "They're running late because they had to stop by the foundation office to drop off the monthly report." The monthly reports were part of their program requirements, detailed documentation of how they were implementing the changes they'd committed to making. It was accountability in its most practical form, and while they'd initially resented the oversight, they'd come to appreciate the structure it provided. "How do you think they're doing?" Madison asked. At 14, she'd become remarkably perceptive about adult dynamics, probably because she'd been forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about her own family. "Better," I said honestly. "Much better than I expected." It was true. The Sterling family's transformation had been more genuine than I'd dared to hope. Veronica had thrown herself into learning about systemic racism and class privilege with the same intensity she'd once devoted to charity galas. Richard had restructured his new business to prioritize fair labor practices and had become an advocate for domestic worker rights within his professional network. Even Bryce had surprised me. After his initial attempt to distance himself from his family's scandal, he'd eventually returned to participate in the program alongside his parents. His apology had been more sincere the second time around, and his commitment to change seemed genuine. The doorbell rang, and Connor jumped up to answer it. "Mom, Dad, guess what? Ellie helped me with my math, and I got all the problems right." Veronica hugged him tightly, and I was struck by how different she looked now. Gone was the perfectly coiffed socialite who'd once treated me like an inconvenience. In her place was a woman who'd learned to find meaning in something other than social status and designer clothes. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," she said, then looked at me with the genuine warmth that had taken months to develop. "Thank you for helping him." "Of course," I replied, and meant it. Richard carried in bags from the local grocery store, another change that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. The man who'd once expected me to handle every domestic task now insisted on contributing to our shared meals. "I brought ingredients for that pasta dish you taught me," he said, unpacking vegetables and fresh herbs. "Though I still can't make the sauce as well as you do." We moved into the kitchen together, and I watched this family that had once been so broken work together to prepare our meal. Madison chopped vegetables while Connor set the table. Veronica and Richard worked side by side at the stove, and for a moment, it felt like we were just a normal family sharing a normal evening. But we weren't normal, and we never would be. Too much had happened, too much pain had been caused and endured, for us to pretend that everything was simple now. What we had instead was something more complex and perhaps more valuable, a relationship built on honesty, accountability, and the hard work of becoming better people. "I have some news," I said as we sat down to eat. The foundation received approval for the Domestic Worker Education Initiative. We'll be offering college scholarships, vocational training, and business development loans to domestic workers and their families across the country. "That's incredible," Madison said. "How many people will it help?" "We're starting with 1,000 scholarships in the first year, but the goal is to reach 10,000 families within 5 years. The program was one of many that had grown out of the Foundation's new mission. In 6 months, we'd launched legal aid clinics, advocacy training programs, and a national hotline for domestic workers facing abuse or exploitation. The $5 billion I'd committed was already changing lives across the country. "There's something else," I continued. "I've been asked to testify before Congress about domestic worker rights. They're considering federal legislation that would extend basic labor protections to household employees." The invitation had come from Senator Elizabeth Warren's office, and it represented an opportunity to create systemic change that went far beyond what any foundation could accomplish alone. "Will you do it?" Veronica asked. "Yes," I said without hesitation. It's time for domestic workers to have a voice in the policies that affect their lives. After dinner, while the children worked on homework and Richard cleaned up the kitchen, Veronica and I sat on my back porch with cups of tea, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. "I never thanked you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For giving us a chance to be better. For not destroying us when you had every right to." I considered her words carefully. I didn't do it for you, I said finally. I did it for Madison and Connor. And I did it because destroying you wouldn't have honored Sophia's memory or helped other domestic workers facing the same treatment I endured. Still, she said, you could have chosen revenge. Most people would have. Most people don't inherit $12 billion and the power to reshape entire systems, I replied. With that kind of power comes responsibility to think beyond personal grievances. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, two women who'd traveled an impossible distance from where we'd started. 6 months ago, Veronica had been the entitled socialite who'd made racist jokes while I served her guests. Now she was someone I could have an honest conversation with, someone who'd done the hard work of examining her own prejudices and privileges. What happens next? She asked. Next, we keep working. The program you're in doesn't end after a year or two. It's a lifetime commitment to treating people with dignity and respect. And the Foundation's work is just beginning. I pulled out my phone and showed her the latest statistics from our programs. We've helped 200 domestic workers file successful wage theft claims. We've provided legal representation for 50 cases of workplace abuse. We've funded educational opportunities for 300 workers and their children. The numbers were impressive, but they represented something more important than statistics. They represented lives changed, families lifted up, and a system slowly being transformed from the inside out. There's going to be a documentary, I added, about the whole story, my time with your family, the inheritance, the Foundation's work. The producers want to show how individual transformation can lead to systemic change. Will we be in it? Only if you want to be. But I think your story, the story of a family that chose to change rather than double down on their prejudices, could be powerful for other people to see. As the evening wound down and the Sterling family prepared to leave, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this point. 6 months ago, I'd been invisible, powerless, grieving in silence while enduring daily humiliations. Now I was one of the most influential philanthropists in the country, with the platform and resources to create lasting change. But more than that, I'd found a way to honor Sophia's memory that felt meaningful and lasting. Every domestic worker who received an education through our programs, every family that escaped exploitation through our legal aid clinics, every child who grew up seeing their parent treated with dignity, they were all part of Sophia's legacy now. Ellie, Connor said as they were putting on their coats, will you come to my soccer game on Saturday? Wouldn't miss it, I promised, ruffling his hair the way I'd done 1,000 times before. And will you help me with my science project? Madison asked. It's about social justice movements, and I want to include what you've done with the Foundation. I'd be honored, I said, meaning it completely. After they left, I stood in my doorway watching their car disappear down the street, thinking about how much had changed and how much work still lay ahead. The Sterling family's transformation was remarkable, but they were just one family among thousands who needed to examine their own behavior and make similar changes. The Foundation's work was expanding rapidly. We'd received inquiries from domestic worker advocacy groups in 12 countries, all asking for support in building similar programs. The model we'd developed in Greenwich was being adapted for communities across the globe, and the impact was already measurable. But perhaps the most satisfying change was the one I saw in myself. For 8 years, I'd carried the weight of grief and invisibility, believing that I'd lost everything that mattered when Sophia died. Now I understood that her death hadn't ended my story. It had redirected it toward something larger and more meaningful than I'd ever imagined possible. My phone buzzed with a text message from James Morrison. The president's office called. They want to discuss your domestic worker bill testimony. Also, Time magazine wants to do a cover story. And there's interest from 3 major publishers about a book deal. I smiled, remembering the woman who'd scrubbed toilets and endured racist jokes while planning her quiet revenge. That woman could never have imagined the platform I now had, the voice I'd found, or the power I wielded to create change. but she would have been proud of what I'd chosen to do with it. As I prepared for bed in my own house, not a servant's quarters above someone else's garage, but a home that belonged to me, I thought about the domestic workers who were still invisible, still voiceless, still enduring the kind of treatment I had experienced. Tomorrow, I would continue fighting for them. Tomorrow, I would use my voice to speak for those who couldn't speak for themselves. And tomorrow, I would remember that sometimes the most powerful revenge is refusing to become the thing that hurt you, choosing instead to become the thing the world needs most. The little girl who dreamed of becoming a scientist would have been proud of the woman her mother had become. And that, more than any amount of money or power or recognition, was the victory that mattered most. Before I turn off the lights tonight, I want to ask you something. How are you feeling after hearing this story? I hope wherever you are in the world, whether you're listening while commuting to work, relaxing at home, or taking a break from your own challenges, you're feeling inspired to see the people around you, really see them. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories about justice, transformation, and the power of refusing to let cruelty have the last word. Share this with someone who needs to hear that their voice matters, that their dignity is non-negotiable, and that sometimes the universe has a very long memory when it comes to balancing the scales. Leave me a comment telling me about a time when someone underestimated you, or about a moment when you chose kindness over cruelty. Because every story like mine starts with someone deciding that they deserve better, and that the people around them deserve better too. The work continues, the fight goes on, and the invisible are becoming visible one story at a time. Until next time, remember, you are seen, you are valued, and you have more power than you know. Ava.